Metal Gear Solid is a franchise that has always pushed the boundaries of what gamers expect and what they think they want in countless ways. As such, the series is no stranger to divisiveness, misunderstandings, and straight-up outrage from fans and newcomers alike. Even the hardcore fans, who are generally always excited to go through another journey with Solid Snake or Big Boss, still have their issues here and there. The rabbit hole of fan theories and wild metaphorical interpretations of various events in the series seems to be never-ending, as it can be difficult to tell the difference between things in the series that are bizarre for a reason that makes sense when looked at through a different lens, while other events are bizarre for the sake of being bizarre. This storytelling method can make for some fantastic, deep, and complex characters that are insanely fun to get into, but it can also spell trouble when it misses the mark. Obviously, with Metal Gear Solid being such a long-running franchise that has gone under the evolution that it has, spanning across decades and multiple platform generations, it's bound to create some divisiveness somewhere along the line. But which has been the most divisive? Well, let's take a look. The elephant in the room here is probably Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Most longtime Metal Gear Solid fans agree that while MGS5 is a great game with excellent mechanics and production values, it just doesn't live up to the other Metal Gear games in some very important areas. Most would agree that the change in Big Boss's voice actor was a bad move, the characters lacked the depth and consequence on the storyline that characters from previous games had, and the ending pulled the rug out from under you in a way that made you feel kind of like everything you just did was a little bit pointless. So while there is a mix of opinions on MGS5, I think that the consensus on these points is strong enough that divisive just isn't the right word to describe that game, and I'll just leave it at that. The original Metal Gear Solid was on the PlayStation 1 20 years ago, and because of that, I think whatever flaws it does have are generally forgiven due to its age and the soft spot many of us have for it, as it is the beginning of the new age Metal Gear saga and really raised the bar of what PlayStation gamers could expect from games on the system. Sure, some of the voice acting is a little bit stilted by today's standards, but most of it still holds up quite nicely, and for the time, Metal Gear Solid was one of the best, if not the best example, of excellence in video game voice acting that had ever been created up to that point. If you remove your nostalgia goggles and actually look at some footage of the game, you'll probably notice that it looks worse than you remember, but again, because of how good it was for the time and how it brought cinematic camera angles and pans into the actual game engine instead of just the cinematics, which was very rare for the time, I think its graphics still deserve to be remembered as fondly as they mostly are by the majority of the Metal Gear fanbase. Considering all of the new ground the original broke, I think it's aging well, and I don't notice many people complaining about it these days. In fact, a lot of Metal Gear fans still regard this as their favorite, so I wouldn't call Metal Gear Solid divisive. Metal Gear Solid 2, however, did pull the rug out from under us with a massive bait and switch. If you don't remember, right after the first level of MGS2, and right after we are reintroduced to our favorite hero from the last game and all of his multi-polygonal glory, somewhat reimagined with eyes and lips that actually move now, the game executes one of Kojima's most controversial decisions ever. The game seemingly starts over with a new storyline and a brand new character, Raiden. It's hard for me to remember a more suddenly disappointing feeling I've had in a video game before the moment when I realized that this was actually going to be the main character of the game and I wouldn't be playing Solid Snake anymore. And on top of that, Raiden wasn't nearly as cool or as interesting as Snake, so that definitely put salt in the wound for many fans. That particular blow did get smoothed out over time as the game progressed though. Even though Raiden's interactions with Rose and other characters were never as fun to see as Snake's interactions with Naomi or the Colonel would have been, they still developed into a story that I was interested in. And the fact that you did still come across Snake from time to time, and the overall story of the Metal Gear Solid saga did continue to develop in meaningful ways, also helped out quite a bit. So while the move to have us play another less interesting character was something I ultimately didn't like at first, and many other fans also didn't like it, I think Metal Gear Solid 2's Sons of Liberty is still regarded as a great entry into the franchise by most reasonable fans. Metal Gear Solid 3 made a lot of changes to the gameplay for better and for worse. The camera and many other control elements were modernized, and the setting was completely different from anything we have seen in the previous two games. Running around the jungle's trees, hills, and fields served up a massive change from the concrete steel hallways that served as the backdrop for the previous two games, and to some this was a welcome change of pace that preserved a lot of the same basic gameplay, and to others it was an unnecessary diversion. Another element that kept fans from feeling the same level of enjoyment that they got from earlier titles was the heavily deepened camouflage and hunting mechanics. These mechanics were executed well, and they did deliver a more realistic experience, but they also bogged the player down on menu screens for extended periods of time, managing different variables and stats when some would rather be pursuing their next victim or shooting Stinger missiles at a high D. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater did turn out to be a great game and have one of the best endings in the series, and for that, it is a lot of people's favorite. On top of that, it single-handedly opened up a new era for the franchise to explore later on. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker was received very well despite being stuck on the PSP for a long time. Some fans didn't get to enjoy this excellent sequel to the third game until it ended up being ported, but even then, it did hold up nicely, and outside of maybe looking a little dated due to the limitations of its previous platform, most fans agreed that Peace Walker was a solid entry, so not very divisive there. Metal Gear Solid 4, however, did indeed stir up some animosity from longtime fans with its incredibly long cutscenes, some of which were as long as entire feature films, and a story that was at times so completely out there that fans who had become accustomed to the more grounded realities of Metal Gear Solid 3 and Peace Walker felt quite a jolt as Metal Gear Solid 4 went into a much more liberal science fiction direction that resembled the original 2, but still went even further than they did. Anybody who had been around for the previous games could see that by the end of 4, Kojima and his team probably had no choice but to go a little loopy to tie up as many loose ends as they had created. 4 was supposed to serve as a bookend, not to the franchise necessarily, but to Solid Snake himself, and it did, but in order to make any sense out of the colossal amount of odds and ends that needed explained to wrap up his story, Metal Gear Solid 4 paid the price by having extremely long expositional scenes and explanations that sometimes were too ridiculous to buy into for some. People who preferred Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 over 3 and Peace Walker generally had a lot to love about 4. It brought our favorite character back as the primary protagonist for the first time in a meaningful way since 1998, and it wrapped up his timeline in a massive, expansive story about two brothers who could not be more diametrically opposed, yet in a weird way kind of needed each other to maintain their purpose, and the game really shines for those fans. Some fans of Metal Gear Solid 3 and Peace Walker felt more like the cumbersome nature of the story and the convoluted plot lines were perhaps more pedantic and pretentious than they were groundbreaking or compelling. This is a mainline entry to the series that, for the first time, drove many hardcore fans to actually dislike it. If you've played Metal Gear Solid 4, you are likely in or close to being in one of two thought camps. Either it is your favorite or it is your least favorite. It did exactly what a lot of Metal Gear Solid fans wanted, and it did the opposite of what a lot of others wanted. Sure, there are lots of fans that didn't put it on either end of the spectrum, but still have strong feelings about the long cutscenes, the vague metaphors, and the borderline supernatural elements that permeated the whole story. And for these reasons, it does appear that Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots is the most divisive game in the series.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.